If you bring in triangles into ZBrush, it usually doesn't like them or it doesn't prefer them. But what's interesting is if you work ultra low res and you divide, I'll hit Shift F. So Shift F is the polyframe option over here. Okay. So usually you'll have to turn it off and turn it on. You'll see that it actually converts that triangle into quads basically. So that's kind of nice. It's a little bit of a bonus feature. And there's a triangle out here and that's also converted into quads. And I'm going to undo that smoothing. You can also hit, so if you want to maintain the shape and still edit but get quads out of this, you can actually turn this little button off. That's called the smooth modifier. So when you divide, you see it actually adds more mesh and it quadrangulates it, if you want to say it that way, right? It converts the two triangles into quads, so you can actually maintain some good edge flow. So that's kind of another really, really nice, interesting kind of feature and bonus that in ZBrush is that you can turn off. If you want to maintain a kind of sharper, hard edge in a low-res mesh, you can divide it a couple times, and then we can turn the smoothing back on and divide again. And you see you get kind of more of a sharp edge effect, and we get the benefit of having some quads there. So that's just kind of a little tip inside of ZBrush. Now, the way I like to think about ZBrush, it's really kind of got a few different modes and ways of working. I would say the first way is sort of what I'm talking about here, where we actually go in and divide the mesh. So this is under the geometry tool palette on the right side. So you can divide a mesh, right? And we can sculpt at higher resolutions, but we can still go down to low res and also change the shape there as well. So I'm going to just use a move brush, right? So if I make a change at a lower division, it's going to carry up through the mesh. So this is actually really useful. Right? If I make a major change here, make a major shape change, and then go up in resolution, it carries through above. And the same thing sort of goes for sculpting. Now, if I, oops, let me go back to a damn standard brush, really large brush. If I make a huge change there and go down in res, you'll see that apply to the lowest division. So there's a limitation of this. ZBrush, a lot of functions in ZBrush don't work. So if I want to do an extrusion, I actually would have to either delete my lower subdivision. So there's buttons for that here. I'm at my highest, subdivision 4. So I'd have to delete lower to actually extrude or add more mesh to this. Or I'd have to go to the lowest, right, which is here, this kind of shape, and I'd have to delete my higher. And you can go somewhere between and delete low and high. So if I like that kind of intermediate base shape, I can say, well, let's delete the high and let's delete the low. And then I'll briefly touch upon this. There's something called the Z Modeler brush. This actually adds a Maya style polygon editing toolkit. So when you click on this brush, you can actually extrude polys. And if you keep clicking, you get the same extrusion amount. If you click next to it, it'll actually merge that together. So that's pretty cool. It's got a lot of really fun functions. I can actually add a little edge here if you're clicking over edge. So the functionality of this is that if you're hovering over a polygon, you get a certain action. If you hover over an edge, another action. And over a vertice, another action. And to briefly explain this, if you hold, so let's say you're over a quad, you see a Q mesh a poly. If you hold spacebar, you've got, we'll get into this in more depth later on, but you've got a ton of actions. You've got where those actions are applied or the target. So it could be a region, an area, a single poly, a whole bunch of polys, and then some, finer tuned modifications to that. So this is a really powerful kit. But like I said, when you have divisions on, you can't go in now and do things. It says this is composed of multiple subdivisions. So certain functions, when you have divisions, you usually can't edit the underlying low res mesh. So one of two things have to be done. You either have to go to your low res and freeze this. So what freezing does is it technically hides the layers, the subdivision layers away, and the sculpting detail gets hidden away, so you can actually do an extra extrusion. And then you can unfreeze, which brings back the divisions. Now, you may sometimes get errors between, the two meshes. What I often do instead of this, if I don't have any sculpting that matters, instead of freezing, I often find it better to just go down to your lowest, and you can say delete higher. And then we can, do, Q mesh or do whatever, extrude out whatever new thing you want to do. And then you can divide again a few times. So that's one thing to keep in mind. Just adding divisions to a mesh right away, I find is not ideal. It's something I usually do at the end, and I'll explain this in a minute. So let's say I take off the divisions, or maybe I'll leave the divisions but delete my lower. Oftentimes when I'm sculpting and figuring things out, what I like to do is actually use this thing called Dynamesh. So Dynamesh is down here. It's just in geometry under here. So I use this separate and apart from the divisions. So usually what happens is if we take a look at this, and now I want to start pulling things out. So let's say I want to pull this shape out, right? I start to hit a certain limit. Things stretch. I can't sculpt any detail. What Dynamesh will do is kind of evenly divide up the mesh, so there's a consistent amount of polygons and vertices throughout the mesh. So this is a mode technically, and what that means is once you click and activate it, that mode is on. Right? So you can smooth this out. So I can even smooth away the endpoint, and if I control click and drag, it'll remesh this and actually melt away some of that other stuff that I didn't want. If I, let's say, do something with an insert, so an insert brush, right, it allows you to kind of insert or add a shape to this. So I can drag out a sphere, and let's say I want to overlap this a bit with this mesh here. What'll happen is right now there's a mask. Technically there's a mask on the base, so when you do an insert, it masks the base of the model that's having an insert applied to it, and the inserted mesh becomes unmasked, and you can flip this back and forth. But remember, Dynamesh is an active mode, so when I control click and drag once, it's just going to clear the mask. But because this Dynamesh mode is on, when I control click and drag a second time, it actually now merges the two surfaces together. So now you can actually create a sculpted sort of seamless joint between these. One other thing you might notice is that this mesh has different color codings now, right? There's green here from my extrusion, there's purple from the insert, and then there's this pink from the base of the mesh that I was kind of messing around with. So that's visible when you turn on Shift F or polyframe. And what these are polygroups. I'll explain what these are in a second, but this is a second kind of powerful component to ZBrush. So let's say, I want to sculpt in more detail, but before I do that, I just want to clean up my polygroups. To isolate a polygroup, you hold Control Shift and left click, or tap with your pen. And if you want to hide this, you Control Shift click again. And I can keep going through. If I Control Shift click on this part, that's going to hide this. So I've actually got a couple different green groupings here because I did two different types of extrusions. You can create a new polygroup by hitting Control W. So Control W will basically cycle through different colors, but it's making this whole area one group. So now if I Control Shift click off of the model, it'll make everything visible. So there's a few reasons to polygroup. One reason is, let's say you want to split something off. Well, you can isolate it, and under the subtool palette, we can actually go to split. So I can say split hidden. I'm not going to do it right now, but if I did, yeah, I'll show you guys in a minute, but basically it would split off the hidden part, okay? Another reason, and I'll show you why. So let's say I'm going to up the resolution on this model. I'm going to Dynamesh this really, really high. So it's got a lot of polys now. It went from 23,000 to almost 250,000 polys. So I'm going to just do a bit of smoothing, okay? I'm going to go in and just quickly throw in some sort of random texture here. So I'm going to just switch this around and do something like this. Okay. All right, so I've got some texture on this thing. Now, at this point, let's say I'm ready to turn this into a production mesh of some kind. What I can do is turn off Dynamesh. In Subtool, Subtool is where you see your main mesh, and then you can also see subcomponents of your mesh. So I'm going to actually duplicate this. So I'm going to have two copies. So this is a miniaturized, compressed version of what you would see in production. So I would take this copy that I have, and this is sort of the 1-2 punch I find ZBrush is great at. So Dynamesh, right, good for pulling and melting shapes together and doing some really unique sculpting. I'm going to close Dynamesh, and I'm going to ZRemesh. So ZRemesh allows you to say, look at these polygroups. So I'm going to say keep groups, polygroups. I can set a target poly count. I might say I want this to be I don't know, 3,000 polys. And then I'm going to hit ZRemesh. So ZRemesh, you'll see it bring the poly count way down. So it's going to take a second to calculate. Okay, so you can see actually I have a pretty good, pretty clean, for the most part, low-res mesh, right? And right now what you're seeing is actually the two models overlapping each other, so I can hide the visibility of the original, or I can see them both. I usually like to turn on this button solo, so what that basically means is that I'll only get to see one version or the other. So I've got kind of two copies. I'll come around to this last step. So sometimes too, I will ZRemesh a ZRemesh, so you can see, oh, maybe the edges here are a bit weird, so I might just kind of smooth them out a little bit, and then ZRemesh, maybe even in half. Maybe I'll get really low. Let's see what we can get here. So I got a pretty good, pretty clean, right, low-res mesh, below even the basic lowest resolution Dynamesh. So now let me turn off solo. So what we can do, this is another fascinating part of ZBrush. So this would be my typical workflow. It's not always necessarily the case, but I would usually, let's say, start in Dynamesh, figure out my big shapes, and then Dynamesh. And then duplicate. And on my duplicate, I would ZRemesh, which gives me a clean mesh, right? So this is my Dynamesh. I'll just so you can see that. There's my ZRemeshed copy. And then what we can do under Subtool, there's a little section in Subtool called Project. So what Project will do is scan between the two surfaces and force this new base mesh to follow the contours of this mesh. So it goes surface to surface. So I'll just show you this. If I hit Project All, you see the shape change a bit. And under Geometry, watch what happens. If I divide this to give it more resolution, the resolution will pick up more of the detail. If I divide again, so I usually do this in steps. I divide and project. So divide, project. Divide, project. And so now, if you take a look, I'll just solo this. So this is my divided mesh. There's my Dynamesh and my divided mesh. They're almost identical, right? So now I can go from this kind of rough, chaotic mesh that's the Dynamesh stuff. It did allow me to get a lot of interesting random shapes, but ZRemesh allowed me to basically create a clean production style mesh, and then by dividing and projecting or copying, really projecting is just saying copy this mesh to the, from the old version to the new version. So now I would say I can delete my Dynamesh. I've got this mesh. If I go down to the low res, I'm going to show you guys some other mind-blowing tricks about this poly groups, these color-coded groups. You can go into Z plugin, UV master, just turn on poly groups, hit unwrap, and guess what? It's unwrapped. Usually I like to click on work on clone, and I'll say flatten so you can see what the UVs look like. Those are the UVs. Not bad for a couple clicks, right? And so now what's interesting about this is that if I go down to, let's say, my low res, so this is a really compressed look at a sort of production pipeline of sorts. So let's say I pick a texture resolution. I'll go to 4K resolution, and then I can go to, let's say, my normal map. I'm going to say create normal map, and you'll see it bake out based on those UVs. By the way, I have this thing called GoZ installed. So if you go into preferences, GoZ, I would say just pick your path to Maya, set it up. You click on it, it'll ask you where it is, and then it installs, which now allows you a one-click export. So what's great about this is I can still make changes, I can still sculpt, but now I'm working with a, maybe more on the smaller scale. I'm not making major scale changes at this point since I've remeshed. So this is kind of, GoZ is free and it's included in ZBrush. So now, this thing goes into Maya, and if I hit 6 on my keyboard, I should see my normal map show up. So that's kind of how, simple, direct, and powerful I find ZBrush can be. I'm going to just tweak the color space to raw, which should allow the texture, that normal map to show up. So, I've got this really, really low res mesh, object, 1200 polys, and it's showing the texture. So if I'd even painted color on this, right, I could always just pick a color, go to RGB, fill object. I'm going to just play around. There's something called masking. You can actually mask by things like cavity. So it'll go in and mask little cavity areas. Just to give it a simple secondary texture, for example. Go to fill object. Okay. And then I can simply do the same thing. So if I go in here, I can say texture map now. There's some color on it. Create new from Polypaint. And it's going to bake it out based on those UVs. So I find polygroups are really, really powerful. And then we'll just go Z this over. It's popped in. And as always, I find I have to always reset my normal map to raw. But you can see this incredible kind of one-to-one output, essentially. So it's pretty incredible and it's pretty fast. So again, I typically use Dynamesh for pulling big organic shapes. There are times when I use Dynamesh for inorganic shapes, but I always like to think about polygroups. So we'll talk a little bit about that next.